Brought to you by Nordic Podcast.
Shirin Emily, did I pronounce it right?
Shirin Tinnesand.
Tinnesand.
San.
Tinnesand. Where are you from exactly?
I'm half Norwegian and half Kurdish.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. And because right now, we're sitting here with someone who has studied across the world, mostly devoting a lot of your time, a lot of your service towards human rights, towards refugee camps, especially one of the largest in the world, which was in Greece. And you have not only experienced and seen, but you have also devoted so much of your energy towards these humanitarian efforts. And I am sure there are certain areas we can't go into, and there are certain areas, we would like to expose. But as you just said, the people experiencing these traumas in these places do need a voice. Yes, they have their own voice. But do you feel that stepping away in the shadows sometimes makes it easier or harder to get this message through?
It depends what we're talking about. In general, I will represent the things which are hard for them to speak about, perhaps politically and issues like that. Not because they don't understand the politics of it, but because what they say can be used against them. So even though they do need a platform, and they need a platform as much as they can use it, then there are certain things which they can be punished for, that they need to censor themselves on, like certain topics that the camp management and things like that don't like that they speak about.
Right.
And then I can, step in and be the voice for that, because they can't punish me in the same way that they can do with them. If they punish them, it can implicate their whole asylum process. And I mean, that's the whole reason why they're there.
So most recently, even right now before you came, you're still working in a way. You're on the phone, you're always working. How do you prioritize where your energy goes? Because now, are you still in Greece?
Mentally?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the focus of your work, of the labor, is it mostly in Greece right now? Or?
Yeah. Greece is for sure what I know the best, but that's not to say that it's limited to Greece, because it also happens in Italy, it also happens in Malta and in Bosnia and in Crete and Poland, and like it happens all over. And I think that's one of the big misconceptions. So last weekend I did a panel debate, and in that context I wrote a piece. And in the piece I said quite loudly that in Norway it's not only an issue of how little we talk about it, and then I'm talking about frequency, but also in its width, that it's very narrow. So even I know there's so many people who don't even know that there are refugee camps in Malta. I mean, Malta is completely exhausted in the same way that Greece is. It's just that we don't have the same relation to it. We don't have as many people speaking up for it. And in the grand total, even that's not where the refugees are. They're not in Europe. Actually, the majority of them are what we call internally displaced persons.
Right.
So they're still within their own countries, like in Iraq or in Venezuela or Yemen, Palestine.
So before we go deeper into exactly what's going on in the camps and your goal, your mission there, and also I really want to hear the prognosis. So where do you think we're heading? Why we're heading that direction? But before we go there, you're a very young individual to do what you're doing. I really want to shine light to how you got there as a person, because there are a lot of people probably who have their heart in the right place, but they do not know how to serve, how to apply that emotion. Liking a picture and or sharing a black square, or all these things people do on social media. Yeah, you're ticking a box of aid, but action always speaks louder than words. So you mentioned that you're part Norwegian, right? How did this start? How did this spark for serving humanity through this path? How did it start?
I mean, if you want to go way back, then my family on both sides are super political. So even, from the start, and I was in a super mixed and varied environment where you're just a person. Your preference in terms of sex, it doesn't matter. Where you're from, it doesn't matter. It was all very multinational, but as well also not limited to nationalities, but all
so it was
sorts
very
of
open.
individuals. Super open.
Right.
And also my father, he came to Norway as a refugee, but even that's not the reason. I think the big click for me is that I went to India when I was 18 with my mother, actually. And that was the first time I encountered poverty, like real poverty. And I think that was the click for me, because I was traveling around a lot when I was young. I kind of postponed my studies, and I was working and traveling. And I was traveling to areas where people normally don't go, like Bangladesh. And then I kind of...
What was making you go there, though? Why were you seeking out places, like Bangladesh?
Who goes to Bangladesh? Who knows what's there?
Right.
Nobody knows.
So was it curiosity? Was it just pure curiosity?
It was curiosity, but it was also to get some kind of awareness, I guess. It was to encounter things that we don't really hear about.
Right.
And with countries such as Bangladesh, we only ever speak about it as the name. Like, we heard the name, but we have no idea what's there,
So the first time you saw real poverty at 18 in India, how did that look like, and how did that impact you? And then coming back to Norway, one of the world's richest countries.
Exactly. And when I came back, I got the awareness that, well, people really are not very invested in what's happening in the world, like... and particularly in a country such as India, where there's such a wide gap between the upper class and the lower class, because they exist right next to each other. And I have this image in my head where we're going with a rickshaw or a tuk-tuk, and the driver is saying, oh, this is a 6-star or 7-star hotel or something, and like all the most rich and wealthy and famous people are staying here. And we turn the corner, and there's literally just a guy taking he's going to the toilet up against the wall on the white walls. And it was just this image, it really shows
the contrast, how even though they're living side by side, it's that's insane. But honestly, when you look at even statistics with India, you see that it is the population with the highest amount of gold reserves that are with private citizens. So this split is massive, just like you're saying, and the statistics show that. But then bridging that gap is only possible if one is aware of it.
Exactly, and people are not. And I think for me personally, what really annoys me is in a way, I guess wealth comes with the privilege to choose.
Right.
Because when you're poor, when you're in a difficult situation, you have limited options.
Of course.
When you're in a good spot, you have a lot of options. So the way that I perceive wealth is actually in the privilege of options.
I like that. I like that a lot, because honestly, that is a really nice way to quantify wealth, whether it is as a person or as a country. Because a lot of people see themselves, let's take Norway, for example. A lot of people see themselves as not wealthy in Norway. But if you put it in that unit, if you measure it as, okay, you don't think you're wealthy, but you live in Norway, what are your options? What are your choices? Then they're like, okay, they do have endless options and choices, just as a citizen, a Norwegian citizen.
And just to add something here, I mean, particularly as I was younger, when I was not studying, my father, he was really annoyed, and he was like, why do you keep going to these countries? Like,
were you going alone?
Yeah, I was also going alone.
I can see why he would be annoyed. You're going alone, 18 years old, to Bangladesh.
Well, to Bangladesh, actually, I went with my best friend, which is Norwegian, but we were in Bangladesh, we were 21 or 22, and it's definitely not something you should do. But
no.
It all went well, but for sure, in hindsight, I see that there's a lot of things.
There's a lot that could have gone wrong.
Yeah, a lot, because it's really like one of those unmonitored countries, and
of course,
you will encounter situations where the only option is to bribe your way out of it, and
crime happens.
And that's kind of how Bangladesh functions,
Mm-hmm.
So it's like.
So how did you explain this to your parents?
Well, my mother is super supportive, but with my father, he was very adamant, and he was like, but I gave you every option to have a better life. Why are you not utilizing that? And I told him, but I am, just not the way that you see it, because you gave me the privilege to choose between them. So I'm choosing to go to it rather than to avoid it.
Right.
And that's kind of what privilege is, that I got the option to choose, not that I was forced to be in a different track or path. And
that's honestly is the gift we have of security. You have the option to choose, and I think, seeing it from his perspective, it is a safety thing. It is dangerous. Wow, because I wouldn't be at ease either if my daughter at 18 goes to a third country. But the path that opens up, the experience, the cultural and emotional maturity that comes with it, it will build a life for her or whoever who experiences these things that you can't get anywhere else.
Well, I just find it absurd,
right?
Absurdly unfair that the place where you were born will shape all of you and your future and your privilege. And we deceive ourselves thinking that there are fundamental rights, because in so many different contexts, in so many different locations, the opposite is true. Because it has, like, the whole idea even about having fundamental rights, it's actually locally based. It's implemented at a national level. But if the national level doesn't follow up, it is not going to happen, because it's a two-way deal. Right. In order for you to get your rights, you also have to have the other end to fulfill it.
Of course.
If they don't fulfill it, you don't have it. And that all of this kind of is rooted in the location where you were born and what passport you hold is absurd to me. Because what is the worth of a human who doesn't have rights?
Yeah.
You don't have anything.
No. And I think it was the discussion on Facebook. No, it was the letter. It was the Christmas letter that I read. I think that was after the camp in Greece burnt.
Yeah.
Where literally, if you measured side by side, and that's what they did in that letter, where the refugees wrote a letter and they measured side by side their rights that they had to the European Union's animal rights or regular animal rights on Earth, they were falling short of it.
Yeah.
So they were literally, getting less than what we see today. Animal rights activists are implementing and pushing. And that is kind of like an eye-opening statement.
And it's happening in Europe, and I think that's kind of the main base, because in a way, I suppose, Old Moria, not in even the new camp that they built, but particularly Old Moria, is very similar to the refugee camp in Idlib in Syria. Like
so paint a picture of how the Old Moria camp is or was for people who this is probably the first time they're hearing about it.
So the best way to explain it was that it was a state-administered slum. In a way, it was actually 3 camps. It wasn't just one. So you had one official area, which was an old military area converted into a refugee camp. And at the time when they created it, they said, this is going to be the example of a well-functioning refugee camp in Europe. But then they had a lot of people coming, too many people coming, and this changed from 2015. That's when you started having the big waves of people coming, refugees coming over to Greece. And in 2016, they implemented what is called the EU-Turkey agreement. And that changed because before, Greece had been a transit country. By 2016, when this agreement came into effect, it meant that they had to process their whole asylum application in Greece. So it totally overloaded the system. Because before, people had just crossed through Greece and they'd gone, to Austria, and they go to Switzerland, they go to Germany, and it was kind of spread out. But now everything was centered in Samos, in Lesbos, in Chios, and on these islands particularly. And the whole system was overloaded. And you have to remember, like, Greece is still in a financial crisis. Greece is a paper country, okay? Most of your official documents are still in paper form.
Yeah.
It's not even digitalized. So they didn't have the resources to do it. And the impact on the local community, I mean, in the start, the local community was nominated to Nobel Peace Prize because of their effort to try and help with the situation. But at some point, they just became completely exhausted and fatigued. Because the police station is the same, the hospital is the same, but there's more births being given than ever on the island. Suddenly the police station have to deal with situations that were never accounted before, because it was a super quiet and nice island, and now, you know, they have to deal with these super complicated and tricky situations. So I understand the local population is completely fatigued, and also with it, I mean, the whole situation, it's not a secret that it's also drawn out a lot of, what should I say, questionable characters. So
like questionable characters on what part? And
well, for example, at the start of 2020, there was a whole bunch coming in from all over Europe, representing like the outer right wing, like the violent right wing spectre.
I see.
So European politics in many ways were being fought out on this island.
And obviously that will not only overshadow the human rights aspects, but it becomes, I would say it becomes like an anesthesia where you just see political agendas rather than human beings, where you just see numbers.
Well, to be perfectly honest, it's not only good people coming with these routes, it's also bad people.
Yeah, I mean,
like executioners from Somalia, for example. Like, it's people you really don't want in your neighborhood. But at the same time, these are maybe only representative of 1%, even if it's that. It's a very, very low number. And by far the vast majority are people who are in need of protection and of asylum, and who are only fulfilling and exercising their human right. But this, if you're looking in the media now, there's this constant threat that, like, oh, they're terrorists. And it's not a lie that, yes, some of them are, but it's such a small number that, like, I mean, it's Europe. We should have the resources to be able to find, you know, the 1%, even if it is 1%. And you can't punish the other 99 because of this one threat.
So one thing that I remember is, obviously you have been both at the old Camp Moria and the new one. So now why is it old and new?
So the old one burnt down.
Like, how did that happen? And when was this?
It was 8th and 9th September 2020.
Okay.
And it was a warned catastrophe. It
was warned, you said?
It was warned, yeah.
Okay.
You had 20,000 people, even we don't know the exact number, pressured in without having any basic rights fulfilled. People were living in plastic tents in minus degrees, with no access to electricity, with no access to heat, with a lack of food, and the food quality is really, really low. You wanted to take a shower, if there had been 3,000 people as the camp had estimated, probably there would have been enough water, but there were 20,000 people making use of these resources. So you would only have like 1 or 2 hours of water in the daytime and 1 or 2 hours of water in the afternoon. So if you wanted to take a shower, you know, you had to estimate 2 to 3 hours of standing in line just for food. There was one food outlet. So you were standing in the food line 3 times a day for 2 to 3 hours just to get this rubbish food. And with the COVID, everything that was bad in this camp just got worse. So at the start of 2020, you had over 100 aid organizations, or NGOs, as I will reference it to, working in the camp. And the Greek government they have continuously been putting a lot of responsibilities and been almost outsourcing their duties to the NGOs to provide aid inside the camp and to cover these basic needs, even though it is the Greek government's responsibility, just to emphasize that.
Okay, but is it due to the, as you said, the backflow of lack of resources? Because now that they are in charge of basically everyone who comes in, is like outsourcing, or does it become like outsourcing to alleviate and make it easier for them?
Actually, the structure, the way that I see it, is very similar to almost a failed state. There is no logical reason why they're doing that in Europe. And I would say that no, it's not because of a lack of resource, because EU is basically, you know, the bank for them. So when they do need something, there are resources available. At least that's how I see it. In one way, I see that it's really unfair to place all of it on Greece, because it's like all, particularly the northern European countries, are using Greece as a shield, you know.
That's interesting.
So in one way, it's unfair. On the other end, they have received support, and the support should have been sufficient. There was no...
So how big was the support, and why do you feel it was... I mean, we see why it was not sufficient, but why do you feel it was not reached? Like, it didn't reach the people, this support. That it was sufficient, but it didn't reach.
Well, that's the question. And this is also what we keep saying in interviews. Where did the money go?
How much was it? Do we know? Is there a number?
It's billions, you know.
Right.
I don't have the exact figure in my head, but what I can say is that since the old camp burnt down and the new one was created, I think an estimate of 110 million euros have gone into the new camp. And still, we're with the situation where we're again fearful that somebody is going to die, freeze to death over the winter, because again, there is not a generator powerful enough to supply electricity to even each tent. Now, I'm not talking about each person, but each tent to have a heater. Still, we're at this point. Still, we're at the point where people are not having their basic needs covered. And I think the bottom line, just to emphasize it, to go back to Idlib, is that this is Europe. We can expect more. It is not Syria. It's Europe. We can and we should expect more. And when we're seeing that basic needs in Europe are not being fulfilled, we really need to ask some questions about it. And of course, aid workers like or NGOs, like I'm representative of, we can come in and we can do some damage control, but at the end of it, this is a political problem. There's only so much we can do. We can throw however much resources we want on it, but we're not going to change the situation. It needs to come from a political place.
So to prevent it from sounding hopeless, like, logically speaking, let's say if you were a dictator for a day, what would be necessary to fix, you know, in the short term, this issue? It might be a big question, but, you know, it's very easy to feel that it's hopeless when all the resources and all the, you call it NGOs, and all these people are pushing so much time and money, and then situations arise where, for example, the camp burns down, or people are not doing the job. As you said, it's two-sided. So to make it very succinct, who do we need to push, and what is actually needed? Do we need a more unified vision when it comes to who actually takes in the refugees? Is this a problem of resources or division of resources? Like, what's the main issue here? Because it should end at some point, right?
I don't see it being a problem of resources. I see it, in that case, it's a problem in efficiency and probably even corruption and fraud, most probably. That's not to say that, of course, aid organizations, they still need money to operate projects, and there are some NGOs who are doing fantastic work, and then there's also those who are doing not so great work. But first of all, we need to change the way that we even see and talk about the situation, because for so long now we are referencing it as a humanitarian crisis, and it's not. It's, like I said, it's a political problem. And for the things which have happened in this camp and the things which are still happening, and just to emphasize that what is happening is that you have a lot of people who are refugees, per term,
Mm-hmm.
and asylum seekers per term, they have rights. These rights should be accessible to them, and they're not. They are not able to act out and exercise their rights. So it's a violation of rights. This means we need legal action. We need legal accountability, legal consequence. This is where we need to start. So who should we go after? Well, like I said, it's again almost like a triangulation, because EU plays one part. Because EU, they could have followed it up better. They should have investigated where all their sums of money have gone. That's kind of the first thing. The same thing with the Greek government. In what areas have they violated things,
Right.
and what areas did they need to check themselves? And even on a level of aid organizations, like I said, some of them are great, some of them are not so great. And here we kind of go back to the Greek government, because the Greek government only made it mandatory for NGOs to register last year. This means that you've had a boom of NGOs, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, working there with so-called vulnerable people, or
Right.
at least legally vulnerable, without being monitored. So it's super exploitable. And they were just asked last year to register, meaning they've been in work for
Right.
potentially 5 years without the Greek government knowing who they are, who are they reaching, what's their standard, what's their protocol, who came in. So
but
if you're a child
right.
predator,
Right.
you could have easily accessed
Entered.
those. Yeah, and it's completely unmonitored. And this only just changed last year.
But this sounds very amateurish, right? This sounds
Yes.
very like
It's more.
is it ignorance, or is it that they just don't care?
That's the question.
Because I don't think it's ignorance. You
They're
cannot not know.
unable or was unwilling to do.
Right.
And I can't give you an answer in that.
Right.
But what I can say is that it's more strict to work in a refugee camp in Iraq
Right.
compared to Greece.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, right? So
Actually, it might be more strict to work at a McDonald's in the US than a refugee camp in Greece. Because if you have a record, I don't think you can.
exactly. And some NGOs will
Wow.
have the internal standard that they're asking for such documents, whereas others don't. Because there isn't a main standard on it. And this is also kind of what has opened up for voluntarism. This is what's opened up for a lack of professionalism, which,
Right.
so here you have all of these refugees who are having their rights violated, and then the proposed solution is that it's predominantly young, unskilled persons who have no education, no experience,
Right. Right.
to come and solve the situation. Obviously that doesn't work. So on the one hand you have the asylum seekers who don't know their rights. On the other hand, the people who are working with them also don't know their rights. So who's going to sound the alarm? Because UN didn't do. UNHCR had been on site for 6 years. They didn't sound the alarm.
Because this problem has been ongoing. I mean, even the term refugee camps, this has been ongoing for decades, in different forms, as far as I can remember in my lifetime. And I think maybe part of the problem is we have been desensitized to it. We have been desensitized to the fact that you have thousands of children in a location, and we're literally calling it, a camp, and we're leaving it as that. It's like, oh no, it's normal. Refugee camps are everywhere. And this desensitization obviously is going to stop any sort of progress in terms of innovation, or I would call it, humanitarian rights, because at the end of the day, it's about that. Everything else is stopping the progress of human rights. And that is injustice.
What even is the need for a refugee camp in Europe? In most European countries, you have asylum centers, and they work just as well.
And that was kind of my next question. Do you think that the fact that we are dubbing it refugee camps is actually allowing that space to keep surviving?
I think...
if you understand my question.
I do. I think we need to start erasing our association connected to a refugee and connected to an asylum seeker, because in so many ways it actually serves to alienate them.
Yeah.
It serves to disempower them.
Dehumanize.
Dehumanize, exactly. So this label the association of it has become so strong that it kind of flipped at some point. This label was supposed to empower you as a person. Like, when you're talking about a refugee, there is absolutely no need to victimize or to villainize or to talk about worthy ones or unworthy. There's no need. When you're talking about a refugee in itself, the only thing that you're talking about is citizenship. It's an implication of citizenship. So why are you creating these personas out of it? Because we see this all the time. That is the scary refugee, or, you know, it's the poor mother and child refugee. But there's absolutely no need to create even a character on it. If we just start talking about them as people, already you will have solved so many of the issues connected to it, because we treat them differently. And there's absolutely no need to treat a person whose only difference is an implication on citizenship. And just to add, Julian Assange is also a refugee, but he doesn't fit into the category when we speak about refugees. And that treatment, in many ways, we kind of reduce their treatment and their access to a right. We reduce it into a matter of charity. Why do we reduce anyone's right into a matter of charity? Because it's not charity-based. It's a legal right.
Why is their rights, you know, dependent on charity? That makes absolute sense.
And then as a result, we treat them differently. And like a conversation that we had earlier is like this idea of volunteers when they're coming to places such as Lesbos, which is very accessible, and even it facilitates and opens up for things such as volunteerism, which is volunteer plus tourism combined volunteerism. So it's predominantly unskilled persons. Now, not talking about aid organizations such as Doctors Without Borders, because they also have volunteers, but that's skilled volunteers, just to emphasize that.
And they're also in the camp?
They're also in the camp, and they're doing an amazing job. And I don't know what this camp would have been like without actors such as them.
How many doctors on the... Because, I mean, 20,000 people?
Well...
What's the ratio for medical aid to 20,000 people?
Back then, it was... back in 2020, it was somewhere around 20,000 people. And it was limited. It was limited because back then, first you had a lot of these right-wing actors coming to the island, and they targeted aid organizations, which led to a lot of them to evacuate. So that was my
targeted point. Like physical threats?
Yeah, and they beat them, and they damaged their properties and their materials. So that was my point a bit earlier. So when the pandemic started, the camp was completely unprepared because so many of the aid organizations had evacuated, and they were the ones who were, you know, filling the gaps of providing basic services, and they weren't there. And then the pandemic started directly after, and the camp was completely unprepared for it, and it was just kind of locked up, and it was separated from the city, Mytilene, and the other areas, and the camp was on its own. And we went from over 100 NGOs providing aid and services for the people to, I think, 10 or 15. So obviously this was felt, and this was also why self-organized refugee organizations created, because then they were filling the gap themselves. They were like, nobody's going to come to our rescue. Everyone abandoned us, so we just need to do it ourselves. We can't just sit here passively and wait for somebody to come and help us, because it's not going to happen. And actually they were right, because the aid organizations didn't return until end of May and June. So from March until May, June, they were pretty much on their own.
So do we know why the camp burned?
We don't know. And, you know, looking at it, so many of the actors just all over the spectrum profited from it.
How?
For the aid organizations, they were running lots and lots of fundraisers because, you know, at the time, there was a little bit of media attention around the camp in terms of the pandemic, and then that kind of died out, and nobody were writing about it anymore. And then the camp happened, and, you know, money came in, and so many aid organizations, including ourselves, we just had to cap it and stop the fundraiser because people were so happy to give. So there's that aspect to it. In terms of the refugees, I mean, it couldn't get any worse. At least, I guess that was a shared consensus. But it's Greece, of course, it can get worse. But I mean, I guess that was kind of the consensus that it can only get better
Right,
at this
right.
point, you know, try and speed up the process. And
'Cause- sorry, go for it.
and also, there were 2 organizations who were renting land. And
The land that the camp is on.
yeah, so like I said, it was like 3 camps, and there were 2 organizations who were renting the land on the side, and this is what we refer to as the jungle. In this area, you didn't have any, very poorly with services, if there were any at all. So all the services were centered in the official part. So 48 hours before the camp burned down, the Greek government went out and they said, okay, we'll take the whole area. We're
Mhm.
going to take responsibility for the whole area. So to say who actually burnt down the camp, we don't
Right.
know. And we do know that some young minor Afghans were charged for it.
But yeah,
But also the whole trial,
right.
okay, I wanted to swear, but I'm not going to swear. But it was a circus,
Yeah.
and they were judged in less than an hour.
Wow.
The trial took less than
Right,
an
right.
hour, and a lot of them were charged with adult sentences despite being minors. And the lawyers were saying this and this and this right has been violated in this context.
Mhm.
Like, what is this? So
You know, it's there are 2 things that come to mind when I hear this. The first is the lack of spirituality. And when I say that, I mean that the lack of people who remember and serve, in the sense of, at the end of the day, we're humans, we're all spiritual beings. There is no such thing as borders and countries. It's all man-made. These problems are a direct correlation to mankind putting an imaginary line and saying that's your part, that this is my part. Like you said, a citizenship displacement or what. So it's almost like it is actually a man-made punishment that we are creating for ourselves, and we are suffering and profiting off and leveraging. And that's why one really needs a drastic change. This kind of deep-rooted, honestly, I will call it corruption, because that is kind of what it smells like. And if there's smoke, it's most likely a fire. So this kind of deep-rooted corruption, where you are literally leveraging people's suffering for profit, whether it is donations, money never reaching, court hearing sentences, or putting innocent people in jail. I'm not saying they're innocent or guilty, but in general, you know, this is not the first time stuff like this has happened, where you put someone in jail to cover up something just because you want to keep the water muddy. It all comes down to that. You lack the basic spiritual virtues that safeguard and put man in front of anything. I have seen more, let's say, energy rocked, especially in these Western or first world countries, when, as you said, animal rights are being trampled upon, than when human rights are.
yes, and even, you know, the whole concept of good intention, even we need to revisit this, because it's only in this sector that you can get past with so many things under the notion of it being good intention. For example, you have all of these, like I said, unskilled, uneducated
Mhm.
volunteers going down there thinking, I'll be helpful if I just play with the children. But
Right.
my response to that is, why should you come and play with the children? Because in no other society in the world does parents teach their children to play with strangers.
Right.
We don't do that.
Right.
And even when you set out to take a task and you fail on it, the response is that, but you're still doing such a good job. I know you tried. Like, thank you
Right.
for being there. Instead of, okay, there needs to be some
Improvement.
improvement or discipline or accountability in it. And the way that we talk about it is, for example, like some of the feedback that I tend to get is that I sound almost cynical, because I'm not sitting here crying while I'm talking about it. But if I'm sitting here crying, talking about it, you need to send me home. then I
Yeah.
can't do this job.
Yeah.
It's that simple. It's the same thing as when you're going to a doctor and you're diagnosed with cancer. You want your doctor to tell you the diagnosis and you want to know what you can do about it. You don't want your doctor to sit and sob.
Or sugar-coated.
Or sugarcoat it, exactly. You want to have that sense of professionality from the people around you
Yeah.
when you're in a bad situation. It's not helpful to sit and cry on it, but it is helpful to be angry, because when you're angry, it leads to action, right?
Yeah, when you channel that anger towards, in like, if you're angry because of injustice, if you're angry, that's good anger. When you're angry towards, evil or oppression or dictatorship, that's a good thing to channel.
So that's what we say. Don't be sad, be angry.
Don't be sad, be angry. I really want to, because, okay, there are a lot of things you can't talk about, yes, but all these people in such a cramped up location, obviously there will be crimes that you can't oversee.
Absolutely. And from...
For the listeners, we have a dog in the studio. It's not me breathing hard. It's not Sava behind the camera either.
And actually, this dog is from Moria Camp, the old one.
She is,
yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
So you took her in?
Yeah, kind of, I guess.
How did you meet?
So she went from one Afghan to another Afghan, and the second Afghan, I know him, and I was helping him take care of her. And then he was transferred, and then she ended up with me.
Yeah.
And this dog, talking about what the camp is like, this dog has so many mental illnesses. Okay, we're kind of rehabilitating her into becoming a dog again. So you can imagine the impact it has on humans.
Of course, if an animal that is genetically linked to wolves felt that environment was hostile.
She was scared of everything, and still there are a lot of trigger points for her, and she has a lot of anxiety, and I don't know what, which is also why I need to bring her with me.
Yeah. And that comes back to the question, like, who oversees the safety, security, and the law in these camps, and how's the job there?
So what I will say is that in this pandemic, the camp was as worse as it's ever been. From January to May, 6 people were killed inside this camp.
6?
They were murdered by other people inside the camp.
How?
I'm sure there's
Do
a
we know the
lot of...
details?
I'm sure mostly gang violence, stabbings, this kind of thing. And I'm sure there is a lot of things around it, but I think if we were to place ourselves in this camp, a lot of these people come from warfare, they come from conflict areas, and they're placed in this camp with not even the option to go back. They're just held there on indefinite time with a lack of psychological care, with a lack like mental care, and with a lack of physical care. Your basic needs are not being covered. You're pushed to the absolute outer limits of what a person can endure. And then we question why did these people snap?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they fighting? We would all be fighting in this situation. Even I think if you were to place a German or a Norwegian in this place, we wouldn't even live for a month or two.
Right.
Not because of violence, but because we wouldn't be able to even endure the mental stress that these people are being put through.
Honestly, even in psychiatry and in medicine, we know this for animals, but for humans, people tend to forget that for the well-being of a human being, you need, I've forgotten the exact numbers, but you need like 30 square meters of clean air, quiet time, space, every X amount. Meaning what? Meaning you can't put, thousands of people in cramped up surface areas and expect it to be okay. We have seen that if a human being doesn't get this space and cubic meter of clean air, they will obviously develop PTSD, higher aggression. We see this with rats. We see this with pigs in the lab. But for human beings, we tend to forget that, 8 people living under a roof, it has to be a massive roof for it to be okay. It's not normal.
Okay, I just had to take
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay, you push people to such extreme that they feel like they have absolutely nothing to lose. And then you question the outcome. But even, we talked a little bit about animal rights, but what we've seen from an academic perspective, not only in Greece, but also in Australia, is that if you're treated as a prisoner instead of an asylum seeker, actually you're entitled to more, to better care. And that's how we know that something fundamentally is wrong, because a refugee and an asylum seeker, your legitimacy to have your rights fulfilled is in question. That's kind of what you're doing, when you're an asylum seeker, you're applying. You basically sent an application to the state and said, hey, will you take care of my rights for me? But as a prisoner, you're already part of the system, right? So the only way that you can treat a prisoner is in accordance to the country's laws benefiting or even reducing the rights of the person. So then you're actually on the inside. So going to prison meant that you would have food. It meant that you would have better shelter. It meant that you would have more success in a lot of ways to get mental and physical care.
Probably
Cleaner, access to bathrooms, access to showers in a different way, and water in general. So that's, if we treated asylum seekers the same way that we treat prisoners, they would be well off.
Not that we should treat prisoners bad, by the way, but I get your point.
Yeah, not that we should treat prisoners bad.
Yeah, it's just...
we shouldn't treat refugees worse.
Right. Because there is a minimum threshold, and, it's not because of lack of resources, like you said. The EU printed, 2 trillion just last year? It's not because of that. It's simply where people choose to put money, and what we choose is important. Pick any newspaper in Norway at any time in any store and look at the front page news. It's always, not always, it's most of the time superficial stuff. It's nothing of substance. It's nothing that champions the progression of humans, of human rights, of virtue, of dignity. It's always like tabloid stuff. It's always like the weather. Are we really putting the weather in the front page when we still haven't solved the fact that here in Norway, we having murderers going around with a bow and arrow in Kongsberg? Like, there's an underlying issue that no one is referring to or turning a magnifying glass to, and that issue, again, I come back to it. You don't teach a child virtues. You don't teach a child the dignity that comes with being a human being, applying the virtues day-to-day life, spirituality. When he's an adult in a position of power, why should he sacrifice 100 million in his pocket for someone he doesn't know in some camp? Like, why? What's the logic? Obviously, he wouldn't. And it goes down to, it's corruption, but corruption stems from being taught something at a very young age. As I would say, as young as when you can start already speaking, you're already exposed to, the signs of corruption. I lived in Cameroon until I was 9, and what's funny is the president of Cameroon, what's his name? Paul Biya. President of Cameroon, Paul Biya, he has been president since I was born. So, president, right? And what's interesting is everybody knows, he's a dictator. Everybody knows, it's corrupt. Everyone knows this. But if you ask the regular kid in the street, like, what would you do if you were him? A lot of them say they would do the same thing. And that is not like, they're all bad. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with that education, right? The people who are in power are not educated. You might be diplomatically or academically educated, but you lack a soul. You lack that spiritual education. You're not implementing your soul into day-to-day decisions. And we see that with kids in this example with the president, where they too are lacking this, so the cycle will just repeat. And in the, let's say, countries like Japan or Norway, or let's say Scandinavia and Japan, we actually have the highest, one of the highest in suicide rates, but also best countries to live in. How is that possible? Why are you killing yourselves if it's the best countries to live in? But then we see a third link, a third, let's call it foundation that connects these two countries. And that is also the highest amount of atheism. For me, that's interesting. Because now we're not talking about religion. We're talking about believing in the fact that as souls, we're all connected and we have a responsibility towards every soul. If you remove this ideology from a human being, there's no reason why I should look out for you.
I actually went in depth into this paradox in my studies at some point. And what I found on it was that, yes, also that, but that it's harder to be sad alone. It's harder to be sad alone. It's harder to experience difficult things alone. And you're constantly getting this, what should I say? You're constantly told that, you're in the best country, you have every single opportunity, and you should be happy. And then you're not happy, and you're questioning, what's
happy?
wrong with me, And we're all kind of just putting on this mask where it's almost taboo to talk about things which are difficult. And if we're supposed to talk about things that are difficult, we need to be very dramatic about it. We can't just take it up to a normal level. And it's much harder to face difficulties alone in a society than, be in an environment where everyone is facing hardship. So, for example, when Utøya happened, the terror action, that year, the suicide rate in Norway went down drastically. Because
why do you think?
Everyone was facing hardship that year. Everyone. I don't think there was a single person in Norway who didn't feel that.
So they felt more connected.
Everyone felt more connected, and it was like a collective hardship. But then, fast forward, after that year was passed, things were back to normalcy, and then it spiked. The suicide rate, it spiked again. If you go into the official statistics, you will see this.
And that lack of connection.
Lack of connection, exactly.
So
it's more hard to experience hardship alone than to experience it in a collective way. So, for example, if you go to Thailand, it's like, this is bad and this is bad. And then you go to the next person, they go, this is bad. And they can kind of, this is my hardship and this is my hardship. And we can exchange it on a normal level.
And it's also what happens when you experience hardships together. When you experience hardship as a collective, it's not me versus them. It's us. It's unity. And unity is a virtue. Unity is a spiritual virtue that is experienced or that is practiced physically. It's manifested physically. So even suffering together comes back to spiritual virtues of unity. So I really like that statistic, and I'm gonna use it because it really shows that we are thirsty for a spiritual connection with our neighbors, with each other. We're dying of thirst when it comes to that.
And that's also something that I think is so sad, because particularly like in these northern European countries, we see it as something that is happening so far from us without even noticing that this is coming closer and closer and closer and closer. And already now this is turning into an issue of Russia. It's turning into an into an issue of Belarus and Poland. It's coming closer, and it's only a matter of time until we play a more central role in it. And when I say we, I mean Scandinavia. And our proposed solution right now in the Norwegian government with the new government is that we should any asylum seeker who comes, we want to ship them back. We just go back. And same thing in Denmark, that they, if anybody wants to apply for asylum in Denmark, we should place them in a refugee camp in Rwanda. And that's fine. Like,
right.
What is this, rejecting responsibility? We also have a responsibility. We have a very direct responsibility in what is happening now in Afghanistan. We also have a responsibility in what is happening in Syria on a political level.
Of course. As the quote goes, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. So we're all in it. We're all affected by it.
So why is it so easy for us to just shed that responsibility? Why is it that media doesn't even want to speak about it? There's people dying every single day. Every single day, 18 people, particularly minors, go missing in Europe. In Europe alone. And we don't talk about it. And there will only be this small notice in the paper.
Did you hear about the case? There was a case in the US of a missing couple recently. They were missing in a specific area. When the cops went to look for them in that area, they found like 9 other dead bodies, 9 other missing people that were missing, that were dead, that there was no flyer, like it was not even a case. It's like you're looking for your keys and you find 9 missing bodies. I don't know, but it's crazy how often and how high these things occur in a high rate, and it just goes under the radar.
Everybody knows. Everyone knows. There's some other people that I know. They design this term of empathy fatigue.
Right.
You just don't want to hear more about it. You're so sick and tired of having to discuss this and talk about it again. It's like it's never ending and there's no solution to it. There are solutions to it, but even if we can't even put out the problems, how are we going to discuss solutions?
And that's honestly a good term to even how we started, because we started talking also about being desensitized to all this. It's parallel to that empathy fatigue you spoke about, and also it's parallel to the hopelessness or the feeling of hopelessness that we have to prevent when people hear these things. It's like, nothing's getting better and it's just getting worse, and now a pandemic, right? So we do need to prevent this hopeless feeling and make us sensitive again to hardship, to our fellow man's hardship. But how do we do that?
So that's one level. I think we also need to talk about the paradoxes which we actively act out in this situation. So I'm going to change your question a little bit and go back to voluntarism, because to me this is a really important aspect of all of it, because going back to so many things I talked about again and to repeat myself, it's about rights. And like I said, our proposed solution of fulfilling other people's rights is to send in people who are not professional or educated or have any experience on the topic, and then they're supposed to solve it. And it's kind of like me saying that I am giving the refugees a voice instead of actually giving them the opportunity to speak for themselves. It's all of these things that all of them add to it. So on one end, yes, we're desensitizing ourselves, but the people who are still in the game, we're still also in that rat wheel or hamster wheel. Maybe I explained that.
No, I get that. It's a lot of effort going nowhere.
But also partly of that problem is because this debate in a lot of ways are being led by people who don't necessarily understand the problem. They
don't have the best interest.
They just want to, maybe. Maybe. But also, I mean, like I said, the people who are championing with their flag saying we're here for good intention, they're just kind of fixing. They're creating dependency structures rather than creating sustainable structures, because actually they don't know. They come with the best intentions, but also they don't know. So that's also part of the problem, I would say, that it shouldn't be applicable to everyone to come down And then, a lot of people say, yeah, but it's exactly because I did go down that I was so personally invested in this and that I could come back and start talking about it. Okay, it's great that you're creating awareness, but
right.
also you're not addressing the issues at hand. In a way, when you're talking about people suffering, you're only talking about the symptoms. You're not identifying the problem.
The problems, the actual root cause of all this.
Exactly. And if we want to change it, which I said is a political problem, we need to start talking about it as a political problem. We need to start demanding legal accountability, legal action, that people do get the rights which they are entitled to, and not say that this person is worthy because they're suffering so much and we need more humanity. And that's very often what comes out of the situation. And that's, in a way, we also kind of conditioned ourselves that we need to talk about the situation in this way, to trigger an emotional response.
Because there are short-term and long-term, you could call it, solutions. And the short-term solutions, obviously, it is harsh legal action, because that's how justice will come.
Yeah. So I want to re-quote myself on what I was trying to say, but it's the same thing like when people are saying that they give refugees a voice by speaking for them rather than giving them the option to speak themselves. And it's the same thing when they're conducting all of these simple tasks. So you're creating this paradox that people are so vulnerable that any person can come in and start conducting these tasks, and somehow this is better aid than them actually doing it themselves. And as a consequence, you turn them into passive people in their own situation. So this is why when I started working in Lesvos, our main goal was to, 1, create a platform where they could speak for themselves, and 2, create a platform where they could do themselves, that they could actively solve their own situations and their own problems, because they understand the problems best.
Right.
So when they were creating the new camp, there was a survey between a handful of refugees and a survey between a handful of NGOs, and all the NGOs asking what is the most needed, and all the NGOs, they were saying, clothes, they were saying shelter and kind of more infrastructural things, whereas the refugees, almost in unity, they all said, we need education for our kids. We can go hungry.
Right.
We've done it before. We can be hungry for 2 days at a time. Just give our kids education.
Wow.
So that's the trade-off.
Yeah.
And that's also when, for so long, this debate has been monopolized by NGOs. Refugees have not been able to get out their own agendas in their own pace and in their own way. Meaning, we also missed out on a lot of really important things that they wanted to communicate out.
Of course. I mean, you want to best help someone, listen to them.
So when I started working with the self-organized teams, they were getting a lot of interview requests from various media stations all over the world, and I was doing a lot of pre-interviews with journalists, and the journalist was like, when we finished the pre-interview, then I said to them, don't mention my name, I'm not going to be part of your article, and now I want you to call, Omid, which is the team leader of Moria Corona Awareness Team, and Raid, which is the team leader of Moria White Helmets, and I want you to speak with them because you're asking me about what it's like to live in this camp. But this is not a question to ask me. I know a lot of things, but I can only paraphrase. So if you really want to have good answers, you need to ask them, because they are the ones who are the first-hand experience.
You would think it's a logical thing,
and
to ask the people that are affected.
Yes, but like I said, this sector is so strange. And then the journalists would have all these reservations about wanting to,
why?
Speak with them. Exactly why. And then I would tell them, but hey, if there's a fire, you don't call somebody's aunt. You ask the ones who were in the fire, right? So why is it so normalized that aid workers should speak on behalf of refugees? Like, there are certain things that we can speak about, which, like I said in the start, can be difficult for them. or even like Doctors Without Borders, they will talk about mental health and they have the statistics and all of this. These are things that they should do. And I totally agree with that. But if you're asking questions like, what is it to live in the camp?
Subjective questions.
Don't ask me.
No.
Ask them. And give them the credibility that they understand and know their own situation.
So, where will we... Because honestly, you know, I know that you are still in this and you're still actively pushing and working in this. Where do you see yourself in like a year or two? And where do you see the problem or the camp situation in this year or two?
So, I know that things can get better.
Okay.
Let's just say that. I feel like I already experienced that. And I think we're definitely going the right direction. So already now, inside the camp, with the self-organized teams that I'm working with, they are teaming up with the camp management's technical department, and they're assisting them in maintaining electricity in the whole camp. They are doing all of the waste management in the camp themselves. They are doing food distribution. They're doing clothes distribution. They're doing education, because a lot, also just to emphasize, with the people who are in Lesvos or in Europe in general, these are the most resourceful ones. Yeah. These are the ones who have a lot of education. I met so many people who are way qualified and educated, professors, doctorates, everything. And these are the people who also had the financial capital to make it all this way, because being a refugee is not cheap.
No, of course
it's really expensive. And also the social capital to be able to make it this far. And it's not like they forgot how to take care of themselves by simply taking a small boat ride, because they didn't. I mean, they fled from war-torn countries, and they laid out on journeys that we can only fantasize and try and imagine what it's like.
And the stories of the boat rides.
And then we think that somehow when the boat ride is over, they cannot take care of themselves anymore. Of course they can. And they should be allowed to take care of themselves. Just like, this kind of goes back to the idea of help. You go into a shop and the person who's working there is asking you, can I help you? And you're like, no, I know how to find my clothes.
Right.
You know, you like to be independent.
Right.
And that is rooted in dignity.
Yeah.
And if there's anything that needs to be taken out of everything we talked about, is that they need to be met with dignity. They need to be met with respect.
Met with dignity and respect. Yeah, the basic prerequisites when you meet any human being is exactly dignity and respect.
Which is also why I'm saying, if we just erase the labels of refugee and asylum seeker and just say people, already so many things would be solved.
It changes the narrative when you say there are 20,000 people suffering rather than 20,000 refugees. It changes the narrative.
Even media will not say refugees. Media will say migrants.
I see.
And what is a migrant? When I work in Greece, I'm a work migrant.
Right.
It doesn't mean that I'm out of options, even though that's our association, that work migrants are usually people who come from countries where there's a lack of work options. No, I have options, but I'm still, per definition, a work migrant. And being a migrant, contrary to being a refugee, is not a legal term. A refugee is a legal term.
Exactly.
Inside refugee means you have rights.
Right.
Being a migrant is not the same. There is no legal term promising you rights.
No.
So you have to use the right narrative on it. Even saying people on the move. What is a person on the move? Is it me going to my car?
They have used that term, people on the move?
People use that term. Media even uses that term. And that also just serves to alienate the fact that there's rights.
There is so much to dig out.
So much.
There is so much to.
And even, the whole idea of putting people in these camps and then having all the volunteers to work there. These same people who arrive to Greece and stay in this camp, a lot of them are receiving asylum. And as they process and they move on into Germany and other countries, they're placed in asylum centers where there are social workers, there's therapists, there's psychologists, there's lawyers, all of them professional. But in Greece, the same people in Greece, the opposite is true. They can have a different type of treatment, and that's totally fine. But the second they get into a different country, suddenly they're entitled to a different treatment.
So let's wrap this in a positive, action-based, let's say, thought process, or how can I and whoever else listening that, you know, we are not in Greece, we are wherever we are, help? Is it even possible?
Yes, it is possible.
So what would be the best way to do that? Since, you know, if we send money, money disappears. So what's the best way to help?
Money doesn't disappear in all cases.
Okay, so which ones are the best channels, you could say?
So there are things that you from here can do. First of all, now with the self-organized teams, they have their own Facebook pages, they have their own social media, and this is kind of part of the ripple effects of what we started. Is that now a lot of the NGOs, they are working with what they call resident volunteers, so they have taken them into their team. So it's no longer only volunteers, European volunteers, but it's also people living inside the camp, and they can take a more active role rather than being victimized into paralyzation. That's like the first thing. That's a ripple effect. But go and follow these refugee-driven pages, because they will present their narrative.
Right.
Listen to them. Just
Listen.
start there. Listen to them. Give them the benefit of being listened to. Second of all, question a little bit what you hear. If you see that it's a victimized narrative, question it. Take it out of its context and analyze, is this normal or not? Thirdly, NGOs do need finances to operate their projects. How can I, as a person at home, check if this is a good place to give to? Well, there are certain standards, because actually even this is not hard to differentiate. Go to their webpage, see if you can find their organizational number. Check if there's good ways to contact the organization, because a lot of times they will just have like a contact box. So there's no number, there's no name, there's no email, there's nothing. So if it doesn't look accurate to you, probably it's not.
Right.
And then is, you know, the narrative kind of just following the NGO. Are they pushing more on the need to have money than actually showing what they did with it?
Right.
That's
investigate where it's going as well. Yeah, I see that.
Because you as a giver are actively buying into the narrative presented to you. So if it's important to you that the money goes to what you want it to go to, then you should do this little investigation, because there's nobody else checking it. But you as a person, you as yourself, you can check it, and you can check it real easily. Is there a financial report? Because this should be available. Is there an activity report? This should also be available. If they don't have that, that says something about their level of professionality. Yeah. And even, you know, going into the financial report, for example, if you see that the admin cost has gone from 3 million to 5 million in a year, that's also something to question.
Exactly.
So you don't need to have a master in doing this. You just need to think about it like a company. Yeah. You know?
Why is this extra admin cost if the aid has not also gone up in terms of, you know, have we seen that same increase in aid, 3 to 5?
But even like you wouldn't buy a service from somebody if you see that there's limited ways to reach them. There's no phone number, there's no address, there's no email.
Right.
You wouldn't buy a service from them.
So listen, question, and investigate.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. It was a pleasure having you here. And your little pup, what's his name? Nusha. And honestly, it is so broad of a topic that I don't know if you're going to stay in Norway for a while, if you're going back to Greece soon. Like, which one is it? Are you staying in Norway for a while, or are you going back?
I'm going back.
When?
I think in November.
November. Okay. So when you do return, it will be a pleasure to have you back, and we can kind of continue where we left off.
I think we could make a whole series on this. To be
I'm
honest.
up for it. I'm up for it. But yeah, if you have any closing words, please. If not, thanks. Thank you for your time.
So thank you so much for having me on here to discuss all of these things, which I'm sure a lot of people didn't really want to hear.
No, it is informing people of things that they might not know they want to hear, but once you hear it, you needed to hear it. It's vitamins for the soul, and again, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere.
Yeah. So final words: get invested and get past yourself, because it will at some point in our lifetime, this year, next year, affect us in a much more central way. And just a closing thing, we ask in terms of the Second World War, particularly in Norway, there's so much focus on the Second World War, and we ask, like, why didn't people get more invested? Well, you got your chance now you got your answer, because it's so many parallels to it. And you as a person checking out, well, now you know who you would be during the Second World War, or you as a person getting involved, now you know who you would be during the Second World War. So don't think that this is something that doesn't affect you, because it will.
Amazing.
So
I like that
get
parallel.
into it.
That's brilliant. We'll leave it at that. That's a really good parallel. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.